let me get it going here. Okay, can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
There's been discussion lately about this topic. Appreciate the opportunity. Let me speak about federal tax treatment of private health expenditures, how it affects design of publicly funded universal care systems. I'd also like to acknowledge Charlie Swanson for helping round up some data that I will present some of later. There are two reasons to be interested in federal treatment of tax healthcare, of treatment of how the federal government treats healthcare expenditures. One, can reducing tax exclusions help finance a state universal care system? And two, does the current tax treatment create obstacles to state healthcare tax design? Just for review, there are four possible ways to treat healthcare expenditures. Given one is to give the expenditure no tax reduction. Another is to exclude the expenditure entirely from taxable income, or making the expenditure deductible from taxable income, or offering direct reduction in taxes through a tax credit. Of these four, exclusion and deduction are the two in common use at the federal level. Excluded and deductible status are not equal in their tax effect. Excluded means that that the expenditure is completely not counted in your income for federal or other tax purposes, not subject to Social Security or Medicare taxes, also known as FICA. Deductible is only useful for filers who otherwise itemize deductions. And that's getting to be fewer and fewer people because the increase in standard deductions makes itemized deductions less useful for most people. But even for those who deduct, there are further exclusions. You can only deduct medical expenses that exceed 7.5% of income. And for state and local taxes, including property taxes, state income taxes, et cetera, also known as SALT, they're currently limited to $10,000. Tax treatment varies somewhat depending on who pays. Under the current system, premiums are completely excluded, or whether when they're through an employer-sponsored plan, whether the employee or the employer is actually paying the money. For self-employed, premiums are excluded up to the earned income from self-employment. For other people whose income is from investments, rents, and royalties, their premiums are only deductible on Schedule A to the extent that they exceed 7.5% of adjusted gross income. And for retired people on Medicare, they're deductible on Schedule A premiums like for B, C, D, supplemental, et cetera, but only on if greater than 7% of AGI. Out-of-pocket expenditures, there's a few ways that if employers can pay that, it's excluded from tax. Most other things, if it's paid through an HSA, health savings account, it's fully excluded from income. And other things are deductible, other medical expenses deductible on Schedule A, if to the extent that they exceed 7.5% of AGI. In the switch to single payer, some payments will retain their current tax status. Donations will remain deductible as charitable donations. Individual Medicare payroll taxes, for instance, will continue listed here simply to show that a very few healthcare expenditures are neither deductible nor excluded from income. Tax treatment for a new single payer funding plan will of course depend on the details of the state funding plan. Thus far, state proposals have consisted of some level of employer payroll taxes and individual healthcare taxes based on income. Employer payroll taxes would continue to be excluded from employee income and FICA taxes, same as now. The plans have varied in how they would apply to self-employed persons, so I have not attempted it would depend on how the state specifies that. As to the individual healthcare tax, it would seem probable that the IRS would regard this as a deductible state tax rather than a medical expense or rather than excluded from income. Kip sent me a note earlier saying, asking why I think it's probable that would be deductible as a state tax, and trying to look for a precedent. There really aren't a lot of precedents, but consider that Medicaid is about 1/3 paid by state taxes, but the IRS doesn't say, oh, a certain percentage of your state tax is actually a medical cost. They actually treat it as a state tax. So that's kind of the logic, Kip, that I'm using in believing that the state or the federal government would regard an individual healthcare tax probably as a tax, as a local tax, rather than anything else. Lastly, there may still be some out-of-pocket expenses, but presumably drastically lower than the current out-of-pocket expenses. This table boils down the previous slide into two categories: exempt expenditures and deductible expenditures. In 2019, national private spending on healthcare through premiums and out-of-pocket spending amounted about $1.55 trillion, of which 1.15 trillion, or 75% of the total, was categorized as exempt from adjusted gross income. Well, 400 billion, or about 25%, was categorized as deductible. All but 80 billion of the exempt expenditure comes from the exclusion of employer plans, with the rest of that divided between self-employed premiums, healthcare savings accounts, and a few others. But the major one clearly is the employer exclusion. Using tax expenditure estimates from the US Treasury, exempt expenditures resulted in a tax reduction of about $220 billion a year, compared with just 6.5 billion for deductible expenditures. As a percentage of expenditures, exempt treatment provided a federal tax reduction of 19% on the dollar, compared to just 1.6% for expenditures classified as deductible. The advantage of exempt tax treatment compared to deductible is further magnified by state income taxes and FICA taxes. State income taxes vary from state to state. What is shown here is the 9% incremental tax charged on most filers in the state of Oregon. FICA adds to 15.3%, including both the employer and the employee. And let me just total tax advantage for tax exempt status is over 40% on the dollar, whereas the total tax advantage for deductible status currently is just over 2%. The national level, the total advantage for tax exempt status approaching $500 billion, or about 2,500 per household. This dramatic tax preference for employer-sponsored plans has resulted in the U.S. being an international outlier in the way healthcare is financially knotted to employment. Some prominent Medicare for All funding proposals, including one commissioned by the NNU, written by Perry Institute at Amherst, lead author Robert Poland, have made a bold proposal that the simple elimination of current exempt status for employee health care could raise a quick $400 billion just by eliminating the current employer tax exemption. They make it sound easy money. There are two strong arguments against this bold proposal. The increased federal taxes would actually amount to a new tax placed on workers, which would reduce middle income take-home pay by 10 to 15%. This result would seem unworkable economically or politically. Yes, we do need to design some kind of a new tax anyway, but using this as the model for the new tax would actually spread the result to the new tax unevenly and with little flexibility. So it seemed to me, why not just design a new tax that actually distributes the cost in a manner in which you intend letting, rather than just backing into it like this. The other issue, new taxes paid to FICA, the increase in taxes will not end up in the hands of the state or national. They end up in Social Security. Some of it will end up in Medicare, but particularly higher Social Security taxes would not automatically result in money for healthcare. It would presumably just mean that those people who had paid the higher taxes from whatever state could lose the tax exclusion, that they will get higher benefits in retirement. But my guess is that those people would resent the loss in current disposable income. Also poses dangerous questions. I mean, if you open up the gates to pass through money into healthcare through Social Security, it breaks down some barriers that I think are pretty important. For states considering universal care, there's a lot of risk if new healthcare taxes are not given at least as much exemption or exclusion as the premiums and other fundings that they will replace. Oregon, for example, recently released a task force report proclaiming $1 billion savings from a single payer system. But the potential outflow of tax dollars from the state could be $6 billion from the loss of state exclusion relative to other states. To the three regularly mentioned waivers to be included in the super waiver legislation, it's being suggested that a fourth waiver may be necessary to remove inadvertent tax obstacles to state-based universal care. Excuse me. Recommendation has been submitted to Brocana's staff asking for IRS clarification that any state-based universal care assessment will be treated as tax exempt, at least in the same measure that it is now. It is yet to be determined strategically whether this clarification could be accomplished within the structure of the SEBUCA or would require separate legislation. Answer to the two questions, can reducing federal tax exclusions help finance a state-based system? No, not advisably, I would say. Does tax treatment create obstacles to state healthcare tax design? Yes, and without some federal help, states could be limited to tax structures which maintain or increase the role of employment in funding healthcare. thank you. And if you have any quick questions, I'll be happy to answer as soon as I've had a sip of water.
And I think this is a really an issue that most of us hadn't thought through, and having clearly laid out is really helpful. And I think we'll all need to take it into account in pushing for state-based reforms. Yep. Unmute.
Thank you much, Warren. Did the Oregon Task Force discuss these issues in any detail?
No.
To your knowledge, has anybody else gone into it to the depth you have here?
I am a voice in the wilderness.
Okay, thank you.
Mike?
Yeah, this is slightly off topic, but the discussion makes me wonder if any of our current tax, our estimates on what it will cost or save people, if any of our current methods are anywhere close to helping people predict how they will benefit or suffer financially. There's a lot of these calculators out there, and I don't know if they're valid.
Yeah, I guess I would respond to say until there is an official funding plan, they're all kind of based on surmise. I think they're educational because you can say, if we did a tax like this, this would be the result. And so we can learn, oh, maybe we don't want to do a tax like that or something, but they're all complete surmise until something official is, is ready to head to voters.
Peter?
Yeah, just a question. Warren, did you and Charlie talk to Wyden's office about this?
A copy of the sheet that I think you all got a copy of by email has gone to Emma Preston of Ro Khanna's office, and probably be talking to her within the week.
Yeah, I mentioned Wyden only because I think people were consulting him about 1332 waivers, and the initial response was that it was actually the same point that I think you made in your second to the last slide, was that we can't expect the money that the federal government would accrue by eliminating that tax exemption for employers would be available to help finance a state single payer plan.
Yeah, in talking to a lot of people, I think the belief, I run into a lot of very educated people who believe that money is just sitting there and we just need to go get it. And the money is going to come from somewhere, and we're not likely to like where it comes from.
Charlie?
Yeah, so I wanted to add that one of the things that complicates this is that you can't just have a simple rule that says all of the state healthcare taxes are exempt, because that would actually increase substantially the federal exemption, and there's no way that the federal government would go for that. So one thing we need to be thinking about, and I probably need to work with Warren more on this, is what would be a rational proposal that would, as Warren says, create an exemption that is roughly equivalent to what it currently exists. And it's essentially because among the things that a state, among the sorts of expenditures that a state tax would need to raise is not just what comes from employers now, but also what comes from individuals and what comes from out of pocket. And it's the last two can't be treated just the same without increasing the total tax expenditure. It's like, well, so what do you do about that? And so far, I don't think we've come up with a good proposal of specifically of how it could be treated in a way that was fair and did not cost the federal government money. So we need to be thinking about that. We're not there yet. So
Thank you, Charlie. And you know, I've in talking to these congressional people, it almost feels like part of what needs to be done is actually a CBO study. But I'm a little reluctant to put it in those terms because that could take a long time. But I think it is pretty complex, and in who it affects. You know, what I've been giving is averages, and you really kind of have to understand, you know, which tax brackets and all of that. So there's information that needs to be gotten that I don't confess to have, other than enough. I know enough to know it's a problem.